Well, I hope everybody's having a good day. I'm Talon Mues here with Scout Nebraska, and I'm going to do a quick update on tar spot for this coming growing season. And so, for those of you that may not have seen tar spot before, this kind of is what it looks like here at the end of the season. Tar spot looks kind of like what it sounds like, those black specks. And so, it is a foliar fungal disease of corn caused by Phylocorommatus. The signs that tar spot produces are those black specks. They kind of start circular and then they can elongate to kind of be a diamond shape or there along the veins, which is the most common. And then when things get pretty severe, there's a lot of disease out there. We will see some premature senescence and dry down of that plant tissue as well as some potential fish eye lesions, which are just necrotic circles around those tar spot stromata, which is what those black specks are called. And so this disease does start by infecting corn plant tissue. It doesn't infect a whole lot else. It is very limited to corn and corn only. So if you see black spots on other grasses, on maple trees, or those kinds of things, it's maybe a similar disease, but it's not caused by the same fungus. Um, and so once those black stromata develop, they will be on both the top and the bottom leaf surface, which is a really easy way to kind of tell if it's an abiotic stress or not. Because if it's insect frass or dirt or something like that, it won't be on both the top and bottom surface in the same spot. And so it also is embedded in that leaf, so they do not rub off. And then once those lesions mature, they'll produce spores, and those spores get dispersed through wind and rain splash. And then this cycle repeats. This is a polycyclic disease. The more cycles we get in a season, the more disease there will be, and that is really dependent on the weather conditions and the environment of that pathogen in that field. And so tar spot symptoms do usually appear in that 14 to 20 days after infection. It's going to be closer to 14 days if it's really optimal conditions, lots of moisture and cooler temperatures. If it's a little bit hotter and less moist, we'll see maybe something more towards those 20 days after infection. And so at the end of the season, this fungus will overwinter in that corn residue. It stays there all winter long and contributes to that inoculum load that starts infection the next growing season. And so if you're going corn on corn, you'll see that if you have infested residue in your field, that may be something to look for there early on in late June or so, early July, late July, depending on weather conditions for when that disease gets started up again. And so we do not know if that residue breaks down, if that fungus overwinters just in the soil. That may be some research that's coming along here in the future. And so if you're out in the fields now, you can do a quick look in some of that corn debris. If you're finding these black spots, make sure that it is tar spot and not any saprophytic fungi that's actually helping you break down those leaves. And that's something you can do there at the end of the season or here before the season if there's still residue out there. I know we didn't get a whole lot of moisture, so we don't have a whole lot of decomposition going on out in our fields right now. And so the distribution of tar spot, it started on the eastern part of the state and has been spreading westward. Here in Nebraska, we've now found it in 60 counties the last growing season during 2025. And we document this and monitor it with the Crop Protection Network's Crop Lookout tool. And so we update this all week, every week during the growing season from field samples that you either send in to an extension educator, to the plant and pest diagnostic clinic, and now you can even submit your own photo to contribute to filling out this map through that crop lookout tool on the Crop Protection Network. And so if you think you have tar spot, you can send a photo to the Crop Protection Network tool. You can send it to your local educator, and we'll help you get you figured out on if you're having that disease in your field. And so I talked a little bit about environment already, but really environment is critical for tar spot. And especially when we think about how much irrigation we have in Nebraska. And so my research here was a lot of how does irrigation impact tar spot. And so we'll look into that as well as kind of how are other ways that our irrigation systems can contribute to maybe some management with chemigation of fungicides. And so if you're interested in some on-farm research, we do have a new student, Cole Black, who is contributing to some of that research on tar spot across Nebraska. And so the favorable conditions for tar spot are kind of greater than 75% relative humidity. This is we like humid conditions, moisture. However, there has been studies that show that really humid, consistently very humid conditions may kind of restrict development. So there's a little bit of a sweet spot there of being humid but not too crazy wet. And so our ambient temperatures are extremely important. That 62 to 73 degrees Fahrenheit, those cool temperatures are really critical. And so this photo here on the right is a depiction of Nebraska from the average temperature for August. And so you can see there in kind of northeast Custer County and then spreading through northeast Nebraska, we had those optimal conditions throughout the growing season and even pretty close there during in central Nebraska and eastern Nebraska for tar spot development in 2025. Additionally, greater than 7 hours of leaf wetness, and it's like I said, not consistent, always wet leaves, but kind of intermittent leaf wetness to aid in infection um, in that infection process. And so susceptible hybrids are really going to be critical for managing for development of this disease. We want to be looking for those tolerant and resistant hybrids. And then even late planted corn can contribute to more disease because you're pushing back that growing season. And we know that tar spot is a later season developing disease. And so if you plant a little bit later, your season's extending into those cooler months of August, September, where disease is more likely to be active. And so the abnormal solar radiation levels that we saw last year really, I do think, impacted disease in multiple ways with cooler temperatures. We didn't have super high highs. We also had some smoke. And just a reminder that UV solar radiation, it actually can kill spores that are being moved through the wind up in the atmosphere. And so having that radiation can really help decrease some of that inoculum load. And so when we have high levels of smoke and cloud cover, we maybe don't see as much of that pathogen kill that we would maybe normally see for those spores. And so I really got to thank Eric Hunt, Eric Snodgrass, meteorologists with the university that do updates and show all of us kind of what's going on in the season. So keep an eye out for some of these updates that they have throughout the season. And so the impact of irrigation on corn microclimate, I already talked a little bit about those favorable conditions there on the left. And so when we irrigate our fields, we're seeing an increase in relative humidity. And that can happen for up to 8 hours or longer, depending on current weather conditions. And so this on average is about 8 to 9% higher than our rain-fed conditions, which really bumps it up into that optimal relative humidity range for tar spot. And same thing when it comes to our air temperatures, a decrease in air temperature, probably 2 to 3 degrees cooler for those rain-fed, those irrigated areas than our rain-fed areas. And finally, again, we're introducing moisture into that canopy when we're sprinkler irrigating with our center pivots. And one of the things that we did find is we do get more minutes of leaf wetness closer to the pivot point than we do in the outer span of that pivot. And so that's because that inner pivot's moving slower, it's putting out less volume per minute, but it's irrigating for longer. So it's the same amount of water, just over a longer period. It takes longer for that area to dry. And that's kind of what we're seeing down here on this graph. These yellow bars here represent the outer span. And so you can see over about an hour of time, each one of these bars represents 15 minutes. There was a higher amount of water put out compared to our inner span. Our inner span had a lower volume output, but for a longer period of time. And then when we look at air temperature, we are seeing a decrease when that irrigation begins that persists for longer than that irrigation is going on. And so just keep that in mind when you're irrigating. We are introducing moisture and cooler temperatures into that canopy that may favor disease. And so when we look specifically at disease development, we do see an increase in disease under our irrigated spans for similar reasons. I mean, we have more moisture, we have cooler temperatures, all of those kinds of things. We see this for both tar spot and southern rust. With tar spot specifically, we have started to find trends that we have more disease in the inner span than the outer span, but we haven't found that consistently. And so just keep in mind that you may benefit from going closer to that pivot point if you're looking specifically for a tar spot. And so this research was done on 43 fields, kind of a survey of disease across eastern Nebraska with tar spot. And so when we think about management, crop rotation is not going to be crazy effective. We've got enough corn in the state. Um, Plenty of this pathogen can move through the wind and move from field to field, long distances, and it's a fairly aggressive pathogen. So crop rotation is not going to be your best form of management. And same thing with nitrogen rates. We found no effect um, on tar spot severity with nitrogen rates. That research is coming out of Michigan State. And that same group did some research on seeding rates, and they actually found that lower populations had more disease. And that's probably because of increased spread and movement of that pathogen through that canopy. Um, and so they tested from about 26,000 to 44,000 plants per acre. And so that the most economically optimal rate for tar spot management when we think about our seeding rate was that 29.5 to 31.5 range, which is pretty common, I think, here in Western Nebraska. And so when we think about integrating our hybrid selection and using fungicide applications, I really just want to make sure that you guys are understanding that a moderately tolerant or tolerant resistant hybrid is going to be your most economically efficient management on this disease. And so you can see that even when they did use a fungicide on a tolerant hybrid, it didn't decrease disease maybe near as much. They're actually statistically the same. They have that same letter. But those susceptible hybrids, they do benefit from a fungicide application. So keep that in mind. If you know what seed you're planting this year, go check that catalog, look at that rating, and you may need to look to see if you are more likely needing a fungicide application here during the 2026 growing season. When we think about the timing of that application, we really are seeing the best control from VT R1 to R3. That's just shown the best. We're seeing this really low level here. We're not getting very good control when we're spraying before tassel or after milk. Okay, we do see a bit of a return when we make that application at R4. That's probably because tar spot's a later developing disease. And so there is some benefit there, but really tassel to R3 is going to be your best time to make an application. And really, we need to be making that application before it reaches this 5% on that ear leaf. It can get pretty severe after this. It really ramps up after it gets to that 5% and can be kind of hard to control once it gets past that. And so if you've got an agronomist in the field, somebody that's doing some scouting, you can point them to kind of the Crop Protection Network's disease estimation tool that they have, and they can kind of figure out what 5% is. I'm sure they're already doing a great job out there, but it doesn't mind brushing up on some of those disease estimation skills. So keep that in mind as we're moving forward in the growing season. If you have disease in your field early on, it's more likely, again, you can get more of those cycles in to get to this level where you need management later on in the season. And so some other ways that we can use fungicides. Margins are pretty tight right now. And so some of the things that we could potentially do is applying that chemical ourselves through chemigation. Last year with the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network, we got approached Prima applied at R2 in late July. When we did disease assessments about a month later, we found that we had significantly less disease in our treated plots. That is both tar spot and southern rust really did a very good job of controlling disease in that field. And when we went back and did some yield estimations, we got about 21 bushels greater in our treated plots than our non-treated. And so fungicides really paid last year. It was a really good time that, again, that R2 kind of time period right there in the middle of those important reproductive stages, grain fill stages. And so making sure that we're getting good control. And so this here is an NDVI. You can just see there at the end of the season that fungicide treated portions really outdid what was not treated. And so if any of that information interests you, I mean, please reach out to the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network, to the Corn Pathology Lab, or to your local extension educator, and they can point you in the right direction to do any research on any kind of fungicide or disease management. And so thank you very much for listening. This was a tar spot update with Scout Nebraska.